made a Ferrari vintage style heart cake for one of my favorite F1 teams, first of 10. So let's make it together.
Starting by putting my first layer on the board and crumb coating it just slightly and creating a border to put my cherry filling in, doing the next layer and repeating this process and making sure the border wall is strong enough that the cherry filling doesn't seep through. I'm going to crumb coat lightly. Once that's set from the freezer, I'm going to start my top coat and use a thick border of this cherry red color and smooth it out. So I did melt it a little just to get this really high glossy look to it, scraping it with my scraper and spatula. For our image, it is a laminated heart I cut out. It is not edible, but I'm the only one eating this. Then I'm going in with my large shell tip on the top and bottom, and then a smaller version of that on the top and bottom again, and then on the inner side of the heart. I'm also going to use this tip for my swoops. I'm just going to be using less pressure so they come out smaller, doing that all the way around. And then I'm going to use the same tip again and make an even smaller border in the center of the top and bottom. Going in next with a petal tip to do the next layer of our swoops on top of the original, then a ruffle tip to go underneath our swoops, and lastly a small little round tip for our last layer. The more piping you do, the better these look. And finally, I'm going to go in with that original medium star tip for 2 more borders and we're done. Isn't she gorgeous? I love her so much. And a great way to kick off this new series and a double Ferrari podium in Australia.
Mercedes may not be having a great start to the 2024 season. Let's make this Mercedes inspired F1 cake together.
Starting with stacking my cake layers, I'm using chocolate here and I'm using white buttercream for this just because I don't want too much black and it goes everywhere. So making this as opaque and smooth as possible. Once that's set in the freezer, going in with a pretty thin layer of our black buttercream and getting this super smooth. Placing our laminated image on top. I was pretty disappointed that it came out more blue than teal. Then using a 6B star tip on the top border and then a smaller 21 tip for the gray border, and I'm using the same tip for our turquoise color and repeating the same process on the bottom. Then I'm going to use turquoise to line the top right under our top border, and then in the middle between the black and gray on the top, the more dimension it's giving. Then I use edible glitter and dip these cherries in the Mercedes color. Went in with my favorite 70 ruffle tip, started my swoops, then went in with this 102 Wilton tip for the next layer of swoops, and finally finished with a Wilton 3 for the dots. Same original tip for the final little dollops. And this cake screams Mercedes, AGM, Petronas, whatever the team name is.
Red Bull seems to be having another dominant season, just a little closer of a battle. So let's make a cake inspired by the reigning champions.
Starting with crumb coating and stacking our cakes, I'm using lemon here to kind of represent the yellow on Red Bull. And I'm using white buttercream because navy stains everywhere. So once I get a pretty decent crumb coat on this, I'm going in with my navy color and doing a thick-ish coat, about 1/2 inch, getting this nice and smooth. It wouldn't stick for some reason. I was having trouble. And smoothing it out was a pain in my behind. I couldn't get it even. Something about dark colors. But I'm going in with a 336 tip and putting my laminated image on top and creating this border. So I did this kind of mixed colors of blue and red to get this fun effect. Going in with a 70 tip, which is my favorite tip for our ruffles. Next, a Wilton 102 for our yellow ruffles. It is a petal tip, and this is when I was realizing I was using too much yellow. It was starting to give circus, but if that doesn't represent what's going on in Red Bull, I don't know what does. Going in with a Wilton 32 for our small little star dollops, and then that is the same tip here on the yellow, and finally finishing with the same exact tip on this red, yellow, and blue border, topping the inner side with these yellow dots in a Wilton 3, and finally our cake is complete. Do we think Red Bull's gonna win the Constructors Championship again this year?
McLaren is my favorite F1 team, so today we're making a vintage style heart cake in honor of my favorite team.
So this cake is a 6-inch vanilla sponge, and we're gonna start by putting our first layer on and a thick coat of vanilla Russian buttercream because I forgot to level these cakes out, so I really had to fill in the gaps there. I'm crumb coating in white, that way the orange can be nice and opaque. Once the crumb coat has set in the freezer, we're gonna go in with our papaya orange color, and I'm doing a pretty thick border of this, trying to get this as smooth as possible with my hot scraper. It is time for our laminated image, so I'm going to do the shell border with a 6B tip on the top and bottom. For the image, I wanted to do the white and black writing because those are the other 2 colors of McLaren. Then I'm going in with a 21 shell tip for the lip border and then the bottom border. Now it is time to bring in the blue because I'm so tired of carbon, okay? We need to bring back the blue. So I did these ruffles with the blue, and then I went in with my favorite ruffle tip back in the orange, that same shell tip back in the orange, then a smaller version of that shell tip for blue on the upper lip, and then finally I'm going to use a little small round tip for these little dots. I went in with that shell tip again for these little shells in the center of each ruffle to connect them, and then I thought, you know what, it needs more blue, so I used that same small tip to do a bottom border and then the inner border on top, and this was our completed cake. I don't know if I love it, but it's definitely not my last papaya heart cake for the season. I think next time, white and black piping.
It was just announced, not that we're shocked, that Lance Stroll just resigned to his father's team, so let's make a cake in honor of Aston Martin.
To start, we're going to stack and crumb coat our cake. I'm using a bourbon chocolate cake because, I don't know, that felt rich to me. Then I am going to crumb coat using this teal color, which looks a lot lighter on camera. It is the same color as the Aston Martin logo. Once that crumb coat has set in the freezer, I'm going to go in with a pretty thick coat for our final coat and scrape this out smooth using a hot spatula. Then I'm using a 6B tip from Hobby Lobby for our first piping. Now, tell my printer I have beef with it. I may be a vegetarian, but why is everything I print coming out so much more blue? Okay, I swear this was green. Anyways, so we're gonna put the laminated image on top of the cake, use the shell tip to create a nice border, and repeat that same step on the bottom. Next, we're gonna start our vintage piping on the sides. So using a Wilton 102 petal tip, I did outline these swoops because I wanted them to be perfect, followed up with a Wilton 103 tip, and I'm individually putting silver pearls on. I wanted this to feel pretty luxurious. Finally, with a Hobby Lobby 16 star tip, I'm going in with this fluoro yellow lime color as our final layer of swoops, and then repeating with that same star tip from the beginning, and going in with a Wilton 21 tip for another layer of these star borders. I did the same on the bottom in the floral yellow and the same on the top, and I put pearls on each individual part of the cake because I thought it felt very over the top and rich. I love how this cake turned out, though I did sit there for an hour putting these pearls on.
I feel like Jake, Kick, Saber, whatever the team's name is just the wholesome team on the grid. They're never really going to score points, but they are going to give you quality entertainment. So let's make a cake in honor of the gambling team.
To start, we're going to use chocolate cake layers, and I'm using vanilla buttercream in between just because we are going to be doing a black top coat on this cake, so I don't want a lot of it to stain, because even though my black buttercream is chocolate cocoa based, there is some black food coloring in it, and black food coloring can cause stains. Once I like how the top coat is looking, it is time to put our little steak cutout on top, followed by this neon green color. I love it so much. It's so fluorescent. Using a 6B tip for the top and bottom border, then I'm going in with a smaller shell tip version of this 21 tip to do the top lip border and the bottom border, followed by the first line of swoops in this black color with the ruffle tip 102, and underneath that going in with the green color in another ruffle tip. This is a 70 tip. Back on top of our black swoop, we're gonna go in with a 16 shell tip, and I felt like I needed more green, so I went in between those two black layers and did just dots using a 3 tip, and went back in with a 16 tip on the top and bottom borders again for a little bit more dimension, especially with this little lip edge here. And that is our cake completed. I think it's so cute and a great like monochromatic kind of Beetlejuice-ish cake. I don't know, I think it just embodies everything about this team. Like, don't expect too much, but you just expect fun.
Williams Racing has not had a good 2024 season by sacking a driver, bringing in a new driver, signing a great driver for next season, while also probably touching their budget cap with multiple crashes. So let's make a cake inspired by, well, their messiness.
We're going to start by stacking and crumb coating our cake. I'm using Earl Grey breakfast tea cake layers because the team is British. Crumb coating in white as always, setting in the freezer, and then I'm going to do the final color coat in this blue color, smoothing it out using a hot spatula, and then I'm going to place my laminated image on top using a large shell in a lighter blue color on the top and bottom, and going in with smaller medium-sized shells on the top and bottom borders, and then the inside of the heart on top. For my swoops, I'm using some squiggle lines in our darker blue color. The zigzags represent how I feel with all these team decisions of new drivers, team orders, all this. They constantly have me doing mental math, and I suck at math. Anyways, next I'm doing that light color with some small shell all the way around. And we are definitely going to put bows on this cake because you know what? If there's one thing I think could fix this team is if we coquetified it, if we put bows on the car, or at the very least on Albon and Colapinto, because bows fix everything. Also, Alex Albon is the only man allowed to have a podcast mic. I said what I said. Finishing up with some edible pearl sprinkles because they make everything better. And there is the completed Williams cake. Is it going to win them anything? No, but it's cute. It matches my nails, and it's my favorite so far in this series, so that has to count for something, I guess.
Alpine is very questionable as a team and its team's decisions, with members constantly coming and going, especially with the controversy of dropping Ocon during the last race of the season. So let's make a vintage style heart cake inspired by the French Revolution Civil War.
Starting with crumb coating and stacking our cake, I'm using vanilla because I really don't know what the French enjoy in a cake, but I'm crumb coating in white because I want a nice opaque color since we're using such an electric blue for this diva. And let me say, the current Alpine livery is giving Galinda, okay, and I'm living for it. So I started with a blue base, and I'm so over carbon fiber. I knew I had to bring the pink, okay, and the pink isn't showing up as bubblegum pink like it was in person, but it was bubblegum pink. So I did big shells on the top and bottom border after placing the image logo on top, followed by medium shells in the blue on the inner corner, the upper lid, and then on top of the bottom shell. Finally, it was time to start our swoops, and I really wanted to give this cake that American Revolution feel because that is what Alpine feels like to me, except French. So I did these big droopy swooshes that reminded me of the American Revolution, you know, Betsy Ross, all those people, George Washington, men wearing wigs. On top of that, I went with a smaller shell in blue and then some white dots. I did a rosette pattern on the bottom, top of that blue border, and more white on the top and upper lid, and then I put white pearls everywhere to give this that expensive feel, but also the diva-ness that this cake needed, which is how I imagine Alpine if they embraced the pink and went full yassified cunty, you know, Fernando Alonso era.
V-Carb, Sugar-Free, Cash App, Red Bull, whatever we're calling them, had a interesting season, dropping Danny Rick mid-season, bringing in Lawson, and never acknowledging that Yuki Tsunoda is one of the best drivers in their program. So let's make a vintage style heart cake in honor of their little silly season.
We're going to start by stacking and crumb coating our cake. I'm using vanilla because, well, it's simple. Crumb coating in white buttercream. That way I have a nice opaque base to put my blue top coat on. Once that is smoothed out in the freezer, it's time to start decorating. So their logo is white, green, with hints of silver, and of course blue. So I put the logo laminated image on top with a large blue shell border around that, followed by a medium shell border on the top and bottom, what I like to call the lid, in white to bring in the white of their logo and race suits. Finally, it was time to start our swoops. So I'm using a ruffle tip to go all the way around in that blue color. Then we're going to go in with our highlighter green in a small shell tip. Finally, on top of the white on the bottom, we're going to do these like rosette things in green and the same thing on the top lid in blue. Finally, I put some like white diagonal stripes in the middle of the blue ruffles, finished by connecting each of the swoops with large dollops. Outlined the inside of the image on top in that green color with more shells. Finally, I wanted to tie in that silver color, so I put large silver sprinkles all the way around the cake and little mini white pearl sprinkles. It is giving NFL Seattle Seahawks in a way, but here's our completed cake for sugar-free Red Bull.
It's the end of the 2024 season, which means it's the end of Haas Husbands. So let's make a vintage style heart cake in honor of the American team and their love for chaotic penalties that kept us entertained.
We're going to start by crumb coating and stacking our cake. I'm using vanilla cake layers and, as always, crumb coating in white. And then I'm also going to use the same white for our top coat. Yes, my voice sounds like this because I have strep, but we need to get through this. So after that, we're going to go in with the laminated image of our team logo. And then I decided to do big black shells on the top and bottom. And on top of that, we're going to do medium-sized red shells. Now, the black buttercream was not participating. It was too thick and then it was too thin. I don't know what was her problem, but I'm doing these squiggly shell lines all the way around to start our swoops, going in with that same red tip on top in the shells. And I really wanted to bring out the red because I think Haas, their color scheme, is probably my favorite on the grid. Going back in with that white for little dots under the shells and then really small shells on the top and bottom border. Using that same tip, I'm going to do small red shells on the top of the cake and then medium-sized white shells on top of that. Finally, I needed to yassify this with some girly elements using white bows to represent the kiddo in the garage, and then of course cherries on top. That feels very American, and this is an American tea. And here is our completed cake in honor of the Haas husbands. I'm sorry to see them go, but I am excited for Ocon and Behrman as the new Haas lineup for the 2025 season.
I know you told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's wrong and why